don't know, it was about a week later, I was in here, and they still had all the buns and everything sitting back there. They weren't open, but they were all
Yeah.
sitting on the counter. And I got looking at them, and none of them were moldy, and I thought, you know, if somebody doesn't take care of these, so I put them all in the freezer.
Yeah.
So I left them a note and said I did it, and I figured if they didn't like it, too bad. But I never heard anything from anybody, so I guess I wasn't in too much trouble.
Well, and because, oops.
Real advance notice on the rum sale, it starts today.
I saw it on Facebook.
They had it on
I saw it
God, I'm trying to decide, I've got,
We got enough mums.
I know we do, but you can never have too many flowers.
You can't have too many bums.
You don't have another place to put them.
Yes,
Sure.
just a second, I need to let somebody in here
Okay.
so that Jenny can hear us talk about the kitchen.
Their blank identity.
Good morning.
Good morning.
What do you got?
I'm gonna throw these away too.
Do it.
Um,
Where are you sitting?
Yeah, I'm gonna throw those and hot dogs away, and I'll do it.
That's what I thought.
Think about Jeff Berry, take this off and he's a wreck, but see how it's playing? If I don't see him.
Huh?
I can take that off.
Those are Santa's.
Oh,
Will do.
I can't do it with my fingers and
Oh, there she is.
there she is. Uh-oh.
There you are. I heard you talking, but couldn't see you.
Hey, there's Dwayne here this morning too.
Good
What did you
morning.
do with Georgia? Leave her with grandma? Oh, that's what I figured.
They're homemaking pancakes.
Awesome. That's a worthy thing to do. Let's make sure they get some handouts wherever the stack of handouts are.
Handouts are right here.
And there's writing utensils if need be.
There you go, sir.
That's his son. That's his son.
Okay, and online we got Paul Reek has bowed in to the Say Hi at Bible study. So hello, Paul. And I don't see anyone else there yet. We have Herb and Jenny on the Zoom tube.
On earlier, I don't know.
I did see you.
I was testing it, I upgraded the upgrade,
Downloaded
downloaded the upgrade,
the Zoom.
and I don't know what it was doing with the audio, but I've never had it on TV before.
Oh, okay.
So then I put it on my TV speakers, because I had it hooked up to the TV.
Yeah, okay. But you didn't really have anything to tune into though, like 10 minutes ago.
Right, but I did see you.
Oh, you did?
Before I shut it all down.
You did see me.
Yes.
I was wisping around trying to get everything set up. Well, I suppose we should get started. Normally we see Scott by now, or maybe Tim and Amy, but we'll go ahead and get started. Let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you this morning for giving us examples of courage and faith throughout the generations in the midst of many circumstances. Highlight for us the importance of being faithful, even when our civil government is not, as explained and shown through the testimony of Daniel this morning. Give us courage to hold on to what we know is true, that you are our God. You sent your son to die for us, and you have sent us on a mission to reclaim your sinful world for yourself. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So as was alluded to in the prayer, we are doing an overview of the book of Daniel today, and I'll do a little bit more of opening introduction since we do have some new folks to the Bible study. We've been working through the Bible one book at a time, doing general overviews. So we haven't been doing detailed verse by verse. We've been doing kind of, here's a broad picture of the narrative of the story, and then we go in and zoom in a little bit to look at some key moments. And we've been doing that for the main purpose of equipping us all, making sure I'm not missing anyone, to have a better familiarity with the big story of the whole story of the Bible. That every book of the Bible is a piece in a larger puzzle of the narrative of salvation. And doing this overview helps us be equipped in that regard. We are doing the book of Daniel today. So in the first box there, we kind of briefly go over the context and the history of everything, trying to understand God's plan. And that started at creation. And so my folks who've been here every step of the way, what kind of creation did God make?
Good.
A good creation, yeah. A good creation. And but then we had this downward spiral of sin that interrupted the good creation that started with, the fall of sin with Adam and Eve. But then we see in these Genesis stories, every generation after the next are falling into more sin. It's, it starts with the first murder, but then it just generations of sin compound until the whole world is just utterly full and saturated with sin. And then we have the flood narrative, the Tower of Babel. It shows that the sin continues. After the flood, you think, oh, maybe God fixed the problem. Maybe that sin is taken care of. But what we have Noah making a vineyard and falling into drunkenness right after he got off the boat. That's a signal to us, the readers, that the sin problem is not taken care of. And so eventually God calls a particular family, Abraham's family, and chooses to walk with them in this project of reclaiming this good world from the power of sin. Every step of the way showing how God's abiding presence is not ultimately determinate on our holiness, because Abraham would fail that test right away. He was a goober too. He was a sinner too, but he was faithful. He trusted Yahweh. He trusted the God of Israel. And that story traces itself through generations. Eventually, Abraham's family, a whole nation of them, are enslaved in Egypt. God calls Moses to come and liberate them with God's power alone. And God shows his character principally through the miracle of the Exodus, that he is a God of salvation. He wants to save his people. He wants to protect his people. And not only does he save them, but he promises to be with them. So he makes his presence known at Mount Sinai. His presence continues to abide with them in the tabernacle, in their journey through the wilderness, until they reclaim the land of Israel. God abides with them in the tabernacle, eventually the temple, until we got to last week's study where we looked at kings, where the people asked for a king, well, they got kings. And whether Israel was faithful or not depended on the king, right? And so there were some good kings, but there were a lot of kings that forsook the way of Yahweh, worshipped other gods, intermixed worship of Yahweh with other gods, apostasy, even child sacrifice. It was nasty. It was another downward spiral, like we see. There's this pattern that, if there's a moment where people repent and return to God, there's usually always a downward spiral of sin that comes afterwards. And so the downward spiral got so bad that it resulted in God raising up kingdoms to actually come in, take over, and send the people of God, the people of Israel, into exile. And that's where our narrative comes today. We get a snapshot inside of the Babylonian exile. We get Daniel and his friends who are trying to figure out how to live faithfully in the midst of no longer having a kingdom established by God, but under Babylonian rule and captivity. These lessons are really powerful for us as Christians because we do not live in a theocracy. We do not live in a kingdom defined by God. We live in these United States of America, and then we do have religious freedoms, and this is wonderful and glorious. But God does not rule this land. The collective opinion of 30 million plus people rules this land. And some of those people are Christians, a lot of them are not. And even a lot of them who are Christians don't act like it in the voting booth.
Add a zero. Add a zero.
Yeah.
300 million.
Isn't that what I said?
No.
Oh, I said 30? 300.
It's okay.
300
I
million.
understand.
Yes, 300 million Americans. And so we have to learn, like, what does it look like to be faithful in a time and culture where our culture doesn't necessarily share the same values that we are. Any questions or comments? I know that was always a lot of catch up every time, but it's good to repeat where we've been and how we got here. We get Eileen out of her sheet. Okay, so we'll transition over to the video then. Yeah, you're gonna be able to see. Oh, and Tom, you're right there too.
I'll, adapt.
You'll adapt.
Yeah.
You're flexible.
I am flexible. Not anymore though, I'm way too old.
I mean, you'll hop on a board seat pretty quick if you need to.
No, thank you.
The Book of Daniel. The story is set right after Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem, and they had plundered the city and its temple and taken a wave of Israelites into exile. Among them were 4 men from the royal family of David: Daniel, who's later named Belteshazzar, and his 3 friends who you probably know by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This book tells of their struggles to maintain hope in the land of their conquerors. The book's design seems pretty simple at first. Chapters 1 through 6 contain stories about Daniel and his friends in Babylon, while chapters 7 through 12 contain the visions of Daniel about the future. But this 2-part shape is made even more interesting by another design feature, and that's the book's language. It begins in Hebrew, the language of the Israelites, but chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, a cousin language to Hebrew spoken widely among the ancient empires. But then in chapters 8 through 12, it goes back to Hebrew. This design shows how chapters 2 through 7 are a coherent section, but it also highlights the importance of chapters 2 and 7 for understanding the later chapters of the book. Let's just dive in. Chapter 1 introduces the basic tension of the first half of the book. Daniel and his friends, they're really wise and capable, and they're recruited to serve in the royal palace of Babylon. But they're pressured to give up their Jewish identity by living and eating like Babylonians and violating the Jewish food laws found in the Torah. So they refuse, and they choose faithfulness to the Torah, and it puts them in danger. But God delivers them, and they end up being elevated by the king of Babylon. After this begins the Aramaic section, which you'll see has this really cool symmetrical design. So first, the king of Babylon has a dream that, it turns out, only Daniel is able to interpret. It's about a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, and it symbolizes a sequence of kingdoms, and the head is Babylon. But then a huge rock comes flying in, and it shatters the statue, and it becomes this huge mountain. Now, this dream is the first of many symbolic visions in the book, and this one introduces the basic storyline of them all. Daniel says that the statue represents a train of human kingdoms following from Babylon, and they will all fill God's world with violence. But one day, God's kingdom will come and will confront and humble the arrogant kingdoms of this world and fill the world with the healing justice of God's reign and rule. After this, chapter 3 tells the famous story of Daniel's 3 friends who refuse to bow down and worship a huge idol statue, which, like the statue in chapter 2, represents the king and his imperial power. And so the friends are persecuted. They're thrown into a fiery furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they're exalted by the king, who now acknowledges their God as the true one. After this come a pair of stories about 2 Babylonian kings, the father, Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son, Belshazzar. They're both filled with pride because of their imperial power, and so, like in chapter 2, God warns them both through dreams and then visions, which, also like chapter 2, only Daniel can interpret. He says that both kings are to humble themselves before God, and both kings arrogantly resist. So Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with madness. He becomes like a beast in the field. But then he humbles himself before God, and his humanity returns to him. He's restored as king. This is in contrast with his son, Belshazzar, who doesn't humble himself before God, and he's assassinated that very night. Now, these two stories draw this imagery from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and Psalm 8, where humans are depicted as the royal image of God. He's given them authority to rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air on behalf of God, who is the world's true king. But when human kingdoms forget that, when they rebel and make themselves and their power into a god, they become less than human, like violent beasts who will face God's justice. Which brings us to chapter 6, the pair of chapter 3. And this time it's Daniel who's being persecuted because he refuses to pray and worship the king as a god. And so, like the friends, he's sentenced to death and he's thrown into a lion's den. But God delivers him from the beasts, and like the friends, the king exalts Daniel and praises his God, which brings us to chapter 7. It's the pair of chapter 2 and the center of the book where all its themes come together. It's another dream, but it's Daniel's this time. And ironically, he can't understand the dream until an angelic messenger explains it to him. He sees a series of 4 beasts, one like a lion, then like a bear, then one like a winged leopard, each of these symbolizing an arrogant kingdom. And last of all is a super beast, identified as a really evil empire, and it has lots of horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament, and there's one specific horn who is an image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecutes God's people. Now they are symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their king from the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and he sets up his throne. He destroys the super beast and he exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. We can look back now and see how all of these stories in the first half fit together. The 3 stories of faithfulness despite persecution, these are meant to offer hope to God's suffering people among the nations. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and have become beasts. And so these visions encourage patience, that God's people are to wait for him to bring his kingdom and rule over our world and vindicate his suffering people. But it raises the question about when God is going to do that, and that's what these final 3 visions set out to explore. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about the final 2 beasts of chapter 7, but this time they're symbolized by a ram, who we're told is the image of the empire of the Medes and Persians, and then by a goat, who's an image of ancient Greece. And out of the goat come a whole bunch of horns, one of which symbolizes the evil king from chapter 7. And we're told more about him, that he will attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people and his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel is very puzzled, especially as to when all of this is going to take place. And so he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God said that Israel's exile would only last 70 years. So for Daniel, the 70 years is almost up. And so he asks God to fulfill his promise soon. But an angel comes and informs him that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued. And so their time of exile and oppression will continue on 7 times longer than Jeremiah envisioned. Daniel is deeply disturbed by this, and he has one final vision. We're shown the same sequence of kingdoms. It's Persia, then Greece, and Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north, who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols in the temple, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, this king comes to ruin. Now, there's been endless debate about what all of these visions refer to. Many see a clear connection to the exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. He killed many faithful Jews in Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to the Roman Empire's role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And still others think it will be fulfilled in future events that have yet to happen when Jesus will return. Now the problem is that the symbols and the numbers, they don't quite match any of these views perfectly. But it opens up the possibility that in a sense, they are all right. The book of Daniel has been designed to offer hope to all future generations of God's people. It did so in the days of Antiochus's empire, and it has ever since. This is why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront the oppressive leaders he confronted in Jerusalem. This is why John, the visionary who wrote the Revelation, could adapt Daniel's visions and apply them to Rome of his day and also all future oppressive empires. And so the point of Daniel is that all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong, and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel also holds out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He will rescue his world and his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. And so for every generation, this book speaks a message of hope that should motivate faithfulness. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about.
Okay, so the book of Daniel tells a story of hope in the land of his conquerors. They are pressured to give up their Jewish identity. The visions are about the failure of human kingdoms. Failure of human kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar becomes like a beast,
Or a wild animal.
beast of the field, which corresponds directly to the language in Genesis 1. That's why it's beast of the field. God made the beasts of the field, but then he made man as have dominion over the beasts of the field. So Nebuchadnezzar became like one whom man is supposed to have rule over. And that's what sin. And so there's this really awesome podcast and article that Tim Mackey, the guy who does Bible Project, wrote about how sin turns us into beasts. It takes us out of our rightful place as having dominion and stewardship over God's creation and puts us into subjugation to our own sinful will. It's a great conversation, but he uses that story to show how humans make themselves beasts through sin. Daniel refuses to worship the king as a god. In Daniel 7, an angel has to interpret the dream for Daniel. And I know it seemed like the blanks, you kind of filled them in early and there was a lot of video left, but it was just kind of hard to pinpoint good ones because there was just a lot of really dense information at the end of that video. But what's something that you learned from the video, something that stood out to you, something maybe that you had not heard before?
I had never heard that it was written in 2 different languages.
Yeah,
I thought that was interesting.
yeah, Hebrew and Aramaic.
The thing that really stood out was something they said right at the end, how every generation can use this as like, like what happens and then a promise to come.
Mm-hmm.
And how we've talked this whole time about this downward spiral,
Mm-hmm.
like we're no different.
Yeah.
We're exactly the same. And just like everybody used this when they were talking about the Roman Empire or whatever, we can use it to talk about the governments in the world today.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We have learned more to learn from Daniel about how to live as exiles, as Christians in a sinful world. Those lessons apply directly to how we live and the hope that we hold on to.
Psychologists could learn a lot reading Daniel.
Oh, yeah. I think we all could. Anything else that stood out to you from the video or something you had learned?
Well, to me, it kind of also said, no matter what happens, have hope. To keep going forward. Daniel did not give up. He just, he gave me encouragement to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Set aside our will for his will.
Yeah. It may have been more advantageous for Daniel, like politically, to go ahead and worship the king, right? But he didn't do that.
That was an easy road.
Yeah. It was harder to stick to what he knew to be true. And think about how hard it would be to stick to the truth of that you know about the true God of Israel from Daniel's perspective, right? Most of the people around him, like 95% of them, don't give a hoot about who the God of Israel is, right? And so he sees pagan idolatry all the time, a culture that sees morals differently, sexual morals, purity morals, all these things are different, but he's holding fast to what he knows from the Torah, what was handed down to him. We talk about handing down this faith from one generation to the next, and he's able to stand firm in that, and he knows where the line is. Is he a bad Babylonian citizen? Not at all. He's an exemplary Babylonian citizen, upright in conduct, valued so much that he works in the king's court, right? And so he's going to, well, be in the world, but not of the world, to use Paul's language. He's in it, he's engaged, he is trying to bless where he is put, he's living out his vocation, right? But there's a line, and he doesn't cross that line. He'll walk along with the Babylonian culture so far, but when it demands him to sacrifice his conscience and to do something that he knows is wrong, he cannot cross that line.
He's an example of the Apostle Matthew.
As being a tax collector under the Roman occupation. Yeah. Yeah. So I think we get a blueprint from this of like how Christians are to conduct themselves in the world, right? We're called to be exemplary American citizens. You know, we are to walk in what we call the left-hand kingdom of God, the temporal world, nobly and upright, and, you know, follow it and you know, submit to our authorities in every way that makes sense to do so. But we have a line, right? And that line is, well, you don't make me worship the concept of liberty, or, you know, you don't make me deny my Christian beliefs. And we're, like I said, we're blessed to live in a country that upholds that freedom, right? But it might not always be that case. And of course, we know it's not that case all over the world. And so Daniel's situation actually translates more directly in many other places around the world. Okay. Any other things that you guys want to mention before we zoom in a little bit? We got plenty of time. We're doing good. Herb and Jenny, did you guys have anything from the video?
The thing that impressed me was the fact that the heathen kings recognized the true God.
Yeah. It always makes you wonder, how long does that last? The cycle repeated a generation, right? It happened to one king, and then his son had to have the same thing happen to him. And then it makes you wonder how faithful Babylon became and how long that lasted for. It's almost like, you know, you could call it like almost like an American Great Awakening, where a bunch of people go back to church because of something, you know, like 9/11 or prior ages, but it just takes enough time for things to kind of settle back to normal.
Seems like a lot of people only turn to God in a crisis.
Yes, like George Costanza, right?
Yeah.
Remember last week?
Yep, yes.
That's a George Costanza faith.
Yep, I listened.
He only believes in God for the bad things. It's a Seinfeld quote. Okay, well, let us zoom in. So I will share my iPad screen. One of my goals here at St. Paul, eventually we're going to do a drive to buy a bunch of new Bibles so that we have them everywhere. But we're not that far yet. We're not there yet. Oh, I had this up. Where is it? I don't want to do that. I want to do this. Oh, I had Daniel up, but then I went to Ephesians for something this morning. What's that citation I have? Is the one we're starting on?
Daniel 2:49.
Okay. Okay, so where we're at in the story is that we're wrapping up the story with Daniel helping Nebuchadnezzar with his initial dream. And so now Daniel is already put into a high position, and Daniel brings along his bros, right? He has a team, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so from there, we're going to have them challenged, and we're going to get into the fiery furnace narrative. So does someone want to read starting at verse 49?
I can read. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps.
The satraps?
It's at the end here. It's at the bottom.
Oh, it froze. Well, that's annoying. Because I was scrolling along with you. I know. It works until it doesn't. Yeah. You know, you gotta come back down here. Gotta get past the satraps.
Yeah, it's down right there.
The
Down here.
prefects.
Okay. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up.
I'll take it here. Therefore, at that time, Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the," you ready for this? "Horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews who you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Well, they got an answer for that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. He ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. These men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments. They were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste, declared to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, True, O king. He answered and said, But I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the God Most High, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, their house is laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Okay. And I will stop sharing. So what stood out to you in that story? It's a fairly familiar Sunday school story, I would think.
How he changed his ways.
How he changed his ways. Yeah. And he will praise God a little bit in chapter 4, but as we see in chapters 5 and 6, his son, Belteshazzar, falls into the same pattern, right? I think that's one of the things that we've seen in the Old Testament is that transferring one thing from one generation to the next is really hard. It's always those youngins, those foolish young people who forsake the truth and run off like Chris to the live stream booth. Baby in tow. Baptize that baby. But yeah, it's hard to raise up the next generation in the faith. It is so hard. And so, Nebuchadnezzar was impressed, but that did not translate. And ultimately, well, where's the kingdom of Babylon now? Right? Anything else that you notice about the story? Personally, I get chills every time I read that there were 4 people standing in the furnace. Because I absolutely believe that is a pre-incarnate Christ. The reference to one who is like a son of gods, You know, the word angel shouldn't throw us off. In Hebrew and in Greek, the word angel is a translation for the word that means messenger. We've seen the Malach Yahweh, the messenger of Yahweh, throughout the Old Testament, speaking for God, doing a very Christ-like thing. We think, you know, it's my thought that the second person of the Trinity is very active throughout the interactions from God and Israel. So it's just, I don't know, it just gives me chills every time. There's a fourth one in there.
How interesting too that even though because the fire was so hot, that the men who were throwing them in were killed.
Yeah.
But they came out unharmed.
Isn't that amazing?
Mhm.
The men also said that their God would deliver them, but they also said, if not, that's okay too. We're still serve the true God.
Exactly. And that's faith right there, right? Because it could have been God's will that they suffer as a martyr at that time, you know, but that wasn't God's will. He wanted to make a different point, but they were all right, you know, regardless of what the outcome might be. You know, that's like Paul praising God for the thorn in his side. That's a Christian bearing his cross. That's first generations of Christians from the first 3 centuries be willing to die for the sake of the spread of the gospel. Peter being hung upside down on a cross because he did not deserve the same glory that Jesus got. And so that you know, that's, I think, the coolest thing that comes out of their lips is that if God doesn't save us, that's okay too. And that, you know, that kind of prefigures a prayer that, you know, I do in hospitals, and you'll hear it from the altar too. It's like, I pray, God, of course, you are the God of miracles. You are capable. If it is your will, bring these folks who are suffering miraculous healing. But if not, hold them fast to a true understanding of who you are and who Christ is, and that through their suffering, they will rise again to newness of life, right? That God can do both, and both are good. When my dad was fighting cancer, you know, he would tell us in those last few months that no matter what happens, there's healing either way. No matter what happens, there's healing either way. And now he's healed, right? He's in the presence of Christ. But yeah, good job, Herb. That, I think, is the coolest moment in the story. That and the fourth guy in the furnace. So yeah, we've already talked about this, but how do the actions of these men inspire us to conduct ourselves when called upon in the public square? And then pretend that that's a question mark, that I did not make that mistake.
I think it inspires us to proclaim what we believe, no matter what the consequences.
Yeah.
It's not always going to be easy.
And even though we don't have those consequences, I know many times, like when you're at work or something, you're fearful, or not fearful, but hesitant to speak about your belief, or even that you go to church on Sunday because the other people that you work with do not go to church, do not believe. And so you just kind of want to fit in with your coworkers, so you don't speak of your belief, and yet you should. And I now do, but it took a long time to get there.
Yeah, that's not easy. I think especially today, that if someone who is not in the church hears that you are, they assume 100 different things about you based on what they see in the news and you know, and how Christianity is portrayed. And I really don't like that, for one, but secondly, it gives plenty of opportunities to prove it wrong. And I like that too. Let me show you something about how Christians are. Since you think we're this and this and that, what if I told you this? But yeah, we're getting a lesson here. We're going to take a quick look at Daniel 7, and then we got to wrap up because I got a baptism this morning, and we got to get everything in order for that. Daniel 7, 1. So now we're switching gears. So now, after the narrative of both the fiery furnace and the lion's den, Daniel himself is having visions now, and he's not going to be the interpreter, but there'll be an angel sent. And the key thing I want us to look at here is just some of the imagery. And that's, as Christians ponder, how have we seen some of this imagery manifest? One thing about the video that I didn't mention that I really appreciate is it kind of demystifies these visions. I think sometimes as Christians, we'll start reading some of these visionary things and we're like, what is going on? There is a monkey coming out of a dragon. What? I don't even know what I'm reading. You know, like there are wings on people's ears. What is going on? But this imagery is very ancient imagery. But Tim Mackey summarized it quite ideally. These beasts are symbols of nations, but also symbols of human pride. And ultimately God is going will bring the beasts back into submission, like the Garden of Eden, right? And there'll be one like a son of man who actually fulfills God's call in Eden and actually is a steward of creation that is over the beasts of the field, the beasts of the earth, these warring kingdoms. Really, a lot of the imagery, well, I should say like all of the imagery in these visions really has its birthplace in Genesis and are just explorations of the different ideas that are presented in the book of Genesis. But again, for brevity's sake, I will go ahead and read this. The first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and had visions in his head. Oh, I need to, sorry, I forgot to share. I was being selfish. I was being like a beast of the field. Please forgive me.
You are forgiven.
Thank you, Mike. The word is something to be shared, not held on a tablet screen alone. Okay. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and had visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, 4 winds of heaven were stirred up in the great sea, and 4 great beasts came out of the sea, different from one another. 4 winds represent the 4 corners of the earth. So it spans. So upon the scape of the sea of the earth, we have these four nations. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. And I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast that might be like a noble nation, because it's acting like a person and not like a beast. And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear, was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. A warlike nation, right? After this, and behold, another like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. A good ruling one, I guess. And after this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke into pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different than all other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. Behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and mouth speaking great things. I think that's Greece he's talking about. But again, Tim says these can be interpreted in all sorts of ways. And we're going to 14, right? As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. Like, think about the biggest crowd you could ever imagine. So tens, complete 10,000s. It's a hyperbole to get you into the concept of how massive this is. That's the rhetorical force of using these numbers. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then, because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. I looked, the beast was killed, its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. And as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives are prolonged for a season of time, end of time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, but the clouds of heaven, there came to be one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, and glory, and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting kingdom, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So we got kingdoms, some are good, some are okay, but they're all beasts. They're all beasts, but over them all is this display of this Ancient of Days, this white-robed figure who is over all things. And then all peoples are surrounding the Ancient Days, and then approaches a figure like a son of man, who the Ancient of Days confers the authority to have dominion over all things, that the beasts are under him, and that he has established his kingdom. So, given what we know as Christians, what is going on in this vision?
I think it's God judging. It's God, it's showing God has power over everything. And he's judging the nations, and he can destroy them. Some he takes away their power, but he allows them to go on. But ultimately, their power is under him.
What do you make of that person like a son of man?
Second coming.
It's the fourth guy in the furnace, right? Jesus, there's a lot of titles Jesus is called. Peter calls him Son of the Living God. There's really only one title that Jesus uses for himself. Any guesses on what that title is? Son of Man. Jesus will call himself the Son of Man. And the reason is to directly connect to this vision. That Jesus, second person of Trinity, true God, but also true man, comes before the Ancient of Days, the Father, and is given this dominion, authority, and honor in establishing an everlasting kingdom, which is being birthed through the church. And so these crowds surrounding the Ancient of Days is exactly like the vision in Revelation, where there are crowds of people in white robes around the throne, but on top of that throne is not an Ancient of Days, but the Lamb pierced. So these visions, they're complicated, but they're not at the same time. Because we have all the language, we have all the symbols in our Christian understanding to make sense of what's going on. But Daniel 7, this vision is one of the coolest in the whole Bible. And it's very important for understanding who Jesus is and who he claims to be. Because the Pharisees are hearing Jesus say he calls himself the Son of Man, and they know Daniel 7, because they're in the synagogue, right? They had to study this in seminary, right? So they know what Jesus is claiming about himself, and they see it as blasphemy instead of looking at the picture of what Jesus is ultimately doing and understanding who he is. And it's that relationship there. So anyway, just as a quick recap, because we got to wrap this up, Daniel is a great book that gives us hope in the midst of any sort of trial, but specifically one that comes from outside, like a nation that is ruling over us, or how to have encouragement to own your confession as a Christian in the midst of a culture that is alien to your faith or disregards your faith. And in it, we see that, we are called to be exiled people in our own way, to hold to the faith of God in the midst of any situation. Next time, we'll do a quick look at Ezra and Nehemiah, and that will conclude us looking at books and doing one at a time, this quest through the Old Testament. Because of the switch at September 4th, we are going to be switching gears, and we're going to be following the Sunday school curriculum. So the adults are going to be learning and doing in-depth look at the same story that the kids will be learning in Sunday school, ultimately to foster deeper understanding and conversation and faith growth in the home. That's kind of the design there. That's the purpose of that. But it actually works out pretty well. We're not going to get through every book of the Old Testament, but we are getting through all the historical books. So all the prophets and Psalms and things, those are just added commentary and extra to what we've been covering, this history of Israel. So after we get through the Babylonian captivity, we'll come back to Israel for Ezra and Nehemiah, and that sets us up for the intertestamental period that brings us to the New Testament. And so we will have had a continuity in our study going from Genesis to there. But and hopefully you see that this is, as a narrative of the Old Testament, it's actually understandable. And as you engage with prophets, Psalms, Proverbs, you understand that these are added materials that supplement the history that we have been learning along the way. Any thoughts, questions, concerns, rebellions? We'll talk a little bit when we talk about the intertestamental period, how rebellions aren't really a good thing. That makes us question our American history. So yeah, you got the schedule before you. Ezra and Nehemiah next week. Then after that, we'll do September 5th, framing the Old Testament. That's when we take a step back and we'll try to place some of those prophets and things and try to contextualize them. And then we'll be switching gears to enduring faith on Rally Day. That will be our first day of Sunday school. And we will be moving, this class will be moving into the big room. And we're going to be sharing that space, and we're going to have confirmands with us, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And I hope you're all along with us for the ride.
Rally Day is September
12th. And there's a lot of announcements today at worship that are all about preparing us for that. So you will see, and you'll be apprised, and you'll be all experts about exactly everything that's happening in this church. At least that's my prayer. Speaking of prayer, let's conclude with Luther's morning prayer. And let me do this real quick first. I thank you, my Heavenly Father, through Jesus Christ, your dear Son, that you have kept me this night from all harm and danger. And I pray that you would keep me this day also from sin and every evil, that all my doings in life may please you. For into your hands I commend myself, my body and soul and all things. Let your holy angel be with me, that the evil foe may have no power over me. Amen. Hey friends, we'll see you in worship pretty soon. Thank you, Herb and Jenny, for joining us via Zoom. Thank you for those who were with us during the live stream, but apparently it ended at some point.